Now, basal nuclei, I'm going to combine it, because it's logical, I'm going to combine it with cerebellum. Okay? So, basal nuclei, although it's a part of a cerebrum, cerebellum is not. Cerebellum is the separate structure here. Basal nuclei and cerebellum, they control movements. So, if you think that you do this, don't be so optimistic. Basal nuclei and cerebellum provide even higher level of control. So what they do, very briefly, basal nuclei, those are multiple structures. They inhibit unnecessary moves. Okay? In the cerebellum, it makes movements precise. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about first of all, from a little bit of anatomy. So, do you see on the models the white stuff within the cerebellum? That's white matter. The gray stuff is gray matter. The anatomy, there's a study guide. So, like, you've got 3 lobes. You've got ventral, anterior, posterior, flocculonodular, here at the bottom. There are 2 hemispheres, cerebellar hemispheres. So you've got right and left hemispheres, they connected by so-called vermis. That white stuff actually has a very poetic name, arbor vitae, which from Latin means the tree of life. Okay. Here's the thing, loss of function. What happens to a person who gets cerebellum damage? They become clumsy. Really, really, really clumsy. Does that make sense? What about basal nucleus? Well, kind of a bit torn. So we'll get to the disease. I want to kind of explain how they control your movements. So here you have your basal nucleus. Here you have your cerebellum. Okay? Here you have your motor cortex, and here you have your muscles. So motor cortex is controlling your muscles. Anyone has a problem with that? Good? Obviously. Right? And this is what you do consciously. So if I try to throw this lead, okay, and I try to hit one of those plastic arms, that's my conscious decision. Does that make sense? This is my motor cortex. But how I'm going to throw it greatly depends on basal nuclei and cerebellum. So basal nuclei allow the muscles of my arm to move. So all other muscles that I don't need at the moment stay inhibited. Does that make sense? So basal nuclei will release inhibition. And cerebellum will make the movement precise. Now, I'm going to be anthropomorphic, like, I don't know, whatever. Super anthropomorphic here. So, your basal nuclei and your cerebellum, they have to know what I'm going to do, right? Like, how your basal nuclei can know which muscles to stop inhibiting. So as a matter of fact, your motor cortex sends signals back to the structures, telling them, I'm going to do this. Look, so basically, motor cortex says, hey, I'm about to throw that lead at that arm. Basal nuclei, okay, I let these muscles to move. And cerebellum says, all right, this is how you're going to move them. Neither basal nuclei nor cerebellum have direct control over the muscles. They do not communicate with muscles. Does that make sense? Now, last bit of sort of information processing. Am I going to be throwing it differently whether I'm doing it like this, or like this, or I'm standing on the Basal with my eyes closed? It's all going to be different, right? So basically, your mostly cerebellum has received the following information. It's going to be visual, it's going to be body position, and it's going to be vestibular apparatus, balance. Make sense so far? So it's a really, it is mind-boggling how complex the process of your motor control is. Now, I promised you the disease. Huntington's. Too much movement. It's a genetic disorder in which basal nuclei degrade. Does that make sense? So they can't inhibit unnecessary movements anymore, and you start producing them. This condition, when people start flinching their arms and legs, is called chorea. This is the progressive neurodegenerative disorder. From the time of onset of symptoms to death is 5 to 10 years. It is not curable, it is poorly treatable. Okay? And since it's a genetic disorder, people can know whether or not they're going to have Huntington's. They can get diagnosed. Make sense? Okay, so this is your basal nuclei and cerebellum. We're going to throw in the same pot Diencephalon. Just step out. So Diencephalon. Since this is a review, I'm kind of doing the key stuff here. Diencephalon is pretty cool. So you've got, in the center, you've got thalamus. This central part right here, that's your thalamus. It's a relay. This is all. So all the information that comes to the brain first comes to thalamus, and thalamus redistributes it. For instance, visual impulses that come from your eyes will get to thalamus and then will be directed, some of them to visual cortex, some of them to hypothalamus, some of them to cerebellum, so they will be kind of target. Does that make sense? Hypothalamus. Visceral controls big time. Kind of 80% of your endocrine system, your appetite, your thirst, your sleep, almost all visceral activities, you give me one, I will be able to link it to hypothalamus in one or another way. Almost promise. That makes sense? Almost everything with a few small exceptions, like, I don't know, sugar control, okay? That makes sense? It's a main controller of visceral activities. So, basically, your endocrine, most of it under hypothalamic controls. The fact that your heart rate goes up when you're excited, hypothalamus. So it's a part of the limbic system. So your physiological responses to your emotions, that's hypothalamus. Following me? Like, you smell something absolutely terrible and you barf. That's hypothalamus. And then epithalamus, which is kind of meh. It has a pineal gland in it. It's right about here at the very back. Hypothalamus is this projection downward here. So melatonin production mostly active in kids. In adults, it's very much subsided, almost entirely fibrosed. Not of any particular importance. Okay. It kind of controls your sleep-wake cycle, but again, the major controller of your sleep-wake cycle is hypothalamus. Okay, that's that. Now the last bit for today and the last disease, I promise, but that's going to be fun. That's a really cool disease. It's a brainstem. This thing right here, 3 parts. The top part, you see the bulb, this bulging thing in the center? This is pons. Above pons is midbrain. Under pons is medulla oblongata. Okay? So what we've got here? Let's get rid of pons, the respiratory controls. High level respiratory controls. Like, I speak right now, my respiratory patterns are modified. Does that make sense? This is what pons does. I'm going to put medulla here. Visceral reflexes. When you put the food in your mouth, what are you starting to do immediately? Salivate, medulla. If the food is good, you swallow it, right? Swallowing is medulla. Food gets to your stomach and digestion starts. A huge part of digestion is vagal-vagal reflex mediated by medulla. At some point your stomach realizes, holy crap, that food is no good, and you vomit it out. Medulla. Your cardiovascular system controlled by medulla, your respiratory system controlled by medulla, your digestive, okay, a lot of it. It's kind of a subsidiary of hypothalamus, but even by itself it's pretty darn important. Okay? But here I want to say a few words about midbrain. Pain suppression is one of the functions. And then visual and auditory reflex. What is that? If you hear, you walk down the street and there's a very, very loud bang, what you gonna do? You're gonna jerk and you're probably gonna turn towards the sound. Well, I'm talking about benign bang. Like something just, not something that sounds threatening, right? That's auditory reflex. You following me? Startle reflex. Visual, following the moving object. Go to basketball game and enjoy watching spectators. What they do, right? They follow 10 moving objects, well, subjects, people, okay? And one moving object, the ball. Make sense so far? Here's my favorite. It turns out that one part of midbrain is connected very tightly to basal nuclei. So it does participate to some extent in the control of movements. So midbrain contains a nucleus of gray matter. Gray matter is called, in CNS, it's called nuclei. So nucleus, called substantia nigra, the black substance, which produces dopamine. Okay, the neurotransmitter, you know that. Neurotransmitter dopamine, which then goes to basal nuclei, and it needed to release inhibition. So basically, let me explain. So substantia nigra produces dopamine. Dopamine reaches basal nuclei and tells them, hey folks, release the inhibition on these muscles. Are you with me? So generation of the dopamine by these neurons is absolutely critical for the proper function of basal nuclei. However, in the disease that everybody knows too well, Parkinson's disease, the neurons that produce dopamine are dead. Now, check this out. This dopaminergic, it's called dopaminergic neurons, do not produce dopamine. So basal nuclei cannot do what? It can't release inhibition, and your muscles stay inhibited. So Parkinson's sometimes is referred as too little movement. Okay? Too little movement. So people's movements are repressed, inhibited all the time. Are you following me here? It's like two opposites. Interestingly, both Huntington's and Parkinson's, they have very little effect on the cognitive abilities, unlike Alzheimer's. So people are sane and cognitively solid and everything is fine, but it's the motor disorder. Now, there are treatments. You can do various agonists of dopamine receptors. Okay, that's better. And life expectancy is pretty long. Everybody knows Muhammad Ali. Now, what causes Parkinson's? It can be genetic, and sometimes it is. But we all know that traumatic brain injury is also football players, boxers. For boxers, it's almost a professional disease. I don't know why, well, they get hit in the head a lot. Maybe because of the directionality of kids. Slightly different from football players. That make sense? Actually did spectacularly well today.